In 2015, after nearly a century of defining American electronics, RadioShack quietly filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Across the country, thousands of familiar storefronts locked their doors. Liquidators auctioned off the remaining stock, pegboards of resistors, battery displays, soldering irons, and miles of copper cable. The brand name itself was sold for parts. It was a staggering collapse. RadioShack had survived the Great Depression, the transition to solid-state electronics, and the birth of the home computer. At its peak, there was a store within 5 miles of nearly every American. Yet the empire fell at the exact moment when technology had never been more ubiquitous. The most famous electronics retailer in the country went bankrupt, just as every American was carrying an electronic device in their pocket. But the real story of RadioShack is not only the story of a 2015 bankruptcy, it is the story of how America once bought the future in small cardboard boxes, and what happened when technology became something you no longer built, but simply consumed. Every week, we tell the stories of American devices, platforms, software, stores, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Boston, Massachusetts in 1921. The American technology industry did not begin in a Silicon Valley garage. In 1921, the concept of consumer electronics did not even exist. If an American wanted to hear the invisible signals passing through the air, they had to build the receiver themselves. This was the era of amateur radio. The enthusiasts were called hams, tinkerers who strung massive copper antennas across Massachusetts rooftops and spent their evenings hunched over basement workbenches. To serve this highly technical, intensely dedicated subculture, two brothers, Theodore and Milton Deutschman, opened a small retail store and mail-order business in downtown Boston. They named it after the small wooden structure that housed a ship's radio equipment, RadioShack. For decades, RadioShack was not a place for normal consumers. It was a destination for the initiated. The shelves were not stocked with finished, polished appliances. They were stocked with raw potential, heavy copper spools, bare wires, and vacuum tubes. A vacuum tube, a fragile glass bulb that controlled the flow of electric current before the invention of the microchip, was the glowing heart of early electronics. When a radio broke in a 1930s American living room, the father of the house did not throw it away. He opened the wooden cabinet, found the dead tube, and took the streetcar to a parts store to buy a replacement. RadioShack survived the Great Depression serving this exact need. But by the early 1960s, the original business model was dying. The mail-order catalog business was bleeding money. The company was functionally bankrupt. In 1963, a Texas businessman named Charles Tandy bought the struggling 9-store chain for barely $300,000. Tandy did not care about the romance of amateur radio. He was a retail expansionist who had built a massive family business selling leathercraft kits. But Tandy recognized a fundamental shift in the American market. Technology was no longer just for ham radio operators. The post-war consumer boom was pushing stereos, audio cables, and basic electronics into everyday suburban homes. Tandy looked at the 9 Boston stores and envisioned an empire of thousands. His strategy was brutally simple, yet historically unprecedented. He wanted to place a RadioShack within 5 miles of every single American. To achieve this, the stores had to change. They could no longer be massive, dusty warehouses for specialized engineers. Tandy designed a standardized, small-format retail footprint that could fit perfectly into the corner of a newly built suburban strip mall, a downtown storefront, or alongside a highway auto parts store. When a customer walked into a 1970s RadioShack, they were greeted by a highly specific physical environment. The walls were lined with pegboards. The center aisles featured finished goods like CB radios, Citizens Band radios, a system of short-distance, two-way voice communication that became a massive cultural obsession for American drivers and truckers before cell phones existed. But the true soul of the store lived in the back. There, lining the walls, were the parts drawers. Hundreds of tiny sliding metal and plastic compartments, each meticulously labeled. If an American teenager was trying to build a homemade intercom system for their bedroom, they came to these drawers. They bought a resistor, a tiny ceramic component that limits the flow of electrical current to protect a circuit. They bought a capacitor, a small electronic reservoir that stores and releases electrical energy. They bought a soldering iron, a heated metal hand tool used to melt conductive alloy, fusing copper wires and components together on a green circuit board. RadioShack did not just sell electronics. It sold the fundamental belief that technology was something a normal person could understand, open up, and manipulate. But Charles Tandy's greatest invention was not a product on the shelf. It was the ritual at the cash register. In the 1970s, every time an American bought anything at a RadioShack, even a single 15-cent pack of fuses, the clerk behind the counter was required to ask a mandatory question. "May I have your zip code?" Many customers found it annoying, some refused. But this simple question built one of the most powerful retail engines in American history. Long before the internet, long before email marketing or digital tracking, RadioShack was compiling a massive physical consumer database. They were mapping exactly where the American electronics buyer lived, neighborhood by neighborhood, zip code by zip code. To ensure those zip codes kept returning, RadioShack introduced a brilliant loyalty program, the Battery of the Month Club. They handed out millions of small red cardboard cards to American families. Bring the card into the store once a month, and the clerk would punch a hole in it and hand over a free battery. It was a loss leader, but it worked flawlessly. A father walking in for a free flashlight battery would almost inevitably walk out with a new set of audio cables, a weather radio, or a pack of blank cassette tapes. The habit was cemented. The database and the foot traffic fed into one highly specific purpose: the catalog. The RadioShack catalog was not just a flyer. It was a dense, heavily illustrated, multi-hundred-page book mailed directly to millions of American homes. In an era before search engines, the catalog functioned as a paper index of the future. It sat on family coffee tables and in auto shop break rooms. Children flipped through the glossy pages to look at remote-controlled cars. Hobbyists used it to cross-reference the exact specifications of a transistor. Through the catalog, RadioShack trained the American public to view their local store as the ultimate authority on all things electronic. If a device required power, RadioShack either sold it, sold the cable to connect it, or sold the battery to run it. By the mid-1970s, Charles Tandy's vision was complete. The brand had expanded from 9 failing stores to thousands of highly profitable locations across the country. The database was unmatched. The physical proximity to the American consumer was absolute. The infrastructure of an empire was fully built. The catalogs had conquered the neighborhoods, but the shelves were waiting for the objects that would teach a generation how to build the future. In the 1970s, RadioShack was doing something no other major retailer in America was doing. It was actively educating its customers. It was not enough to merely sell a capacitor or a spool of copper wire. The store had to teach the American public what those components actually did. The primary vehicle for this education was a series of small, unassuming paperback books written by a man named Forrest Mims. Mims was an amateur scientist and writer who began producing Engineer's Mini Notebooks exclusively for RadioShack. These were not dry academic textbooks meant for university classrooms. They were hand-lettered, highly visual guides printed on graph paper, explaining how to build basic electronic circuits step by step. Millions of these books were sold across the country. for an entire generation of American engineers, programmers, and weekend hobbyists. A Forrest Mims notebook bought at a local mall was their first formal education in hardware. For younger Americans, the entry point was even more tactile. It was the Science Fair 150-in-1 electronic project kit. This physical object defined the 1980s American childhood bedroom. It was a cardboard and plastic console covered in actual electronic components: resistors, capacitors, transistors, a tuning dial, and a small paper cone speaker, all connected to tiny metal springs. Instead of using a hot soldering iron, a child would bend a small wire and trap it inside the spring to complete a physical circuit. By following a heavily illustrated manual, an American kid could build a working AM radio, a basic synthesizer, or a moisture detector in a single afternoon. RadioShack was not just selling a toy. They were installing the fundamental logic of electrical engineering into the American home. They were teaching the country that technology was not magic. It was simply a series of logical, physical connections that anyone could master. Because RadioShack provided this raw, unfiltered access to hardware, it accidentally fueled the first generation of American tech hackers. In the early 1970s, before he co-founded Apple, a young Steve Wozniak famously built blue boxes. A blue box was an electronic device designed to mimic the exact audio tones used by the American telephone network's routing hardware. By playing these specific tones into a standard phone receiver, a user could trick the network into granting free long-distance calls. Wozniak and his friend Steve Jobs built these early freaking devices using parts purchased directly from the RadioShack catalog. RadioShack did not sell hacking tools, but by selling the foundational building blocks of the digital world, they became the default supply chain for anyone trying to push the boundaries of American technology. By 1977, the culture of the tinkerer was about to experience a massive paradigm shift. The era of building your own electronics from raw parts was beginning to overlap with a radical new idea: the personal computer. A personal computer, a computer designed for one person to use directly, usually at a desk or in a home, was a staggering leap from the massive corporate mainframes of the era. But in 1977, computers were still largely sold as hobbyist kits. You bought a box of loose chips and boards, soldered them together, and hoped the machine would boot. A RadioShack buyer named Don French and an engineer named Steve Leininger believed the company could sell a fully pre-assembled computer directly to the public. Charles Tandy, the CEO, was famously skeptical. He did not understand why a normal American family would spend hundreds of dollars on a digital machine that did not clearly do anything practical. Tandy eventually agreed to a production run of just 3,000 units. His logic was purely retail-driven. If the computer failed in the consumer market, the company could simply use those 3,000 machines in their own stores to manage inventory and payroll. The machine was named the TRS-80 microcomputer system. It featured a heavy plastic keyboard, a heavy black and white CRT monitor, and a standard audio cassette tape drive used for loading and storing software. To run a program, a user had to put a physical tape into the drive, press play, and listen to the screeching analog audio data transfer into the machine's memory. It was priced at $599, expensive, but remarkably affordable compared to corporate machines. However, the TRS-80 possessed an advantage that no other technology company in the world could match. It had Force 2, distribution, and retail access. In 1977, a young company like Apple was selling the Apple II through a tiny, fragmented network of specialized hobbyist shops. Most Americans had never seen a computer store, but they all knew exactly where their local RadioShack was. When the TRS-80 launched, it did not debut in a Silicon Valley laboratory. It debuted in thousands of strip malls, downtown storefronts, and suburban shopping centers simultaneously. An American family could walk past a shoe store, Marixakaskishi step into a Radio Shack and see a glowing computer screen running a basic program on a display desk. For millions of people, Tiki Krichasaki Yin Sichi Ieimof, the TRS-80 was the very first computer they ever saw in person. The result was a retail shockwave. Tandy had worried about selling 3,000 units. The company sold 10,000 TRS-80 machines in the first month alone. It was a staggering success that redefined the American hardware market overnight. The TRS-80 became affectionately, and sometimes derisively, known in American culture as the Trash 80, but it absolutely dominated the early personal computer era. Before the IBM PC arrived in 1981, Radio Shack was selling more computers than Apple, Commodore, or any other competitor. They had taken the microchip out of the laboratory and placed it on the retail shelf, forcing their cashiers to pivot from selling AA batteries to explaining RAM, storage, and basic programming. Radio Shack was no longer just selling parts to build the future. For a brief, incredible window, they were the ones manufacturing it. By the mid-1980s, the TRS-80 had proven that Radio Shack could sell the future. But the true power of the empire was not a single computer. The true power was an unparalleled, unavoidable physical footprint. Radio Shack had achieved Charles Tandy's ultimate vision. They had wrapped the American map in a net of copper wire, alkaline batteries, and neighborhood convenience. In 1985, if you stood in the middle of almost any American town, you were likely less than 5 minutes away from a Radio Shack. The company operated over 7,000 stores globally, with the vast majority blanketing the United States. They were embedded in the newly built suburban shopping malls of the Midwest, slotted right between food courts and department stores. They anchored strip malls in Texas and occupied narrow brick storefronts in downtown Manhattan. They were in rural towns where the nearest big-box electronics retailer was a 2-hour drive away. This physical proximity created a massive retail moat, a protective business advantage, built entirely on immediate human need. Technology, especially in the 1980s and early 1990s, was deeply physical and constantly required maintenance. A Sony Walkman, a portable cassette player that defined an era of personal audio, was useless if the batteries died on a Friday afternoon. A home theater system, a complex arrangement of heavy CRT televisions, audio receivers, and VCRs, could not function if a single audio cable was missing. When an American family was setting up a new stereo system on a Sunday morning and realized they needed a specific coaxial cable, a thick, shielded wire used to transmit radio and television signals, they did not mail order it and wait 2 weeks. They drove 3 miles to the local Radio Shack. The store survived on the premise of the weekend save. The items they sold were not glamorous, but they were essential. They sold the connective tissue of the consumer electronics revolution. They sold RCA cables, speaker wire, universal power adapters, blank VHS tapes, and endless walls of batteries. But this convenience was a carefully engineered retail trap. To keep customers walking through the door for low-margin items, the company leaned heavily on the Battery of the Month Club. Millions of Americans kept that small red cardboard card in their wallets. When a teenager walked into a suburban mall store in Ohio just to claim a single free flashlight battery, they were forced to walk past glowing displays of remote-controlled cars, robotic arms, and expensive stereo equipment. Much of this equipment carried Radio Shack's own private labels, like Realistic and Optimus. Instead of selling name-brand stereos with thin profit margins, Radio Shack manufactured or licensed their own heavy, wood-grain receivers and massive speakers. A customer who came in for a fuse might walk out with a $300 Realistic stereo system. The sheer scale of their marketing was overwhelming. The Radio Shack catalog had grown from a thin mailer into a massive 200-plus page annual encyclopedia. By the late 1980s, the company was printing and distributing over 9 million catalogs a year. It was a physical index of the American electronic lifestyle, mailed directly to the kitchen tables of the middle class. Inside the store, the environment was highly standardized. Every location across the country smelled faintly of ozone and fresh cardboard. The clerks, often teenagers or retired engineers, were famous for a specific type of aggressive, highly technical customer service. They did not just ring up a purchase, they interrogated the customer about the project. If a father came in to fix a broken garage door opener, the clerk would guide him to the exact replacement resistor in the towering wall of parts drawers at the back of the store. This was a unique era in American consumer culture. It was the moment right before technology became completely sealed, miniaturized, and opaque. In an American basement where a father and daughter spent a Saturday soldering a broken radio back to life, the local parts store did not merely sell wires and silicon. It decided who had the power to understand their own machines, who could fix what was broken, and who felt that the physical world of technology belonged to them. At its absolute peak in the early 1990s, RadioShack was selling 1 out of every 4 batteries in the United States. They were a multi-billion-dollar machine, moving incredible volumes of small, highly profitable accessories. They were the undisputed king of the neighborhood tech save. But the empire was built on a very specific assumption, that the American consumer would always need to connect one device to another with a physical cable. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, RadioShack's cultural dominance expanded beyond weekend repairs and into the center of the American holiday season. The stores became the default destination for highly specific consumer electronics that could not be easily found anywhere else. If a child in the 1980s wanted an Armatron, a popular robotic arm toy controlled by 2 dual-axis joysticks, they could only get it at RadioShack. If a teenager wanted a high-speed remote-controlled car, they went to the local mall and bought a RadioShack Golden Arrow. The company was not just selling components. They were selling closed, finished plastic objects that represented the cutting edge of affordable consumer technology. But as the 1990s progressed, a new technological force began to reshape the American retail shelf. The era of the personal computer and the home stereo was being joined by the era of personal telecommunications. RadioShack saw the shift early. Long before everyone had a device in their pocket, RadioShack became the primary physical bridge between the American public and the mobile network. When an American professional in 1994 needed a pager, a small, wearable wireless receiver that beeped or vibrated to display a phone number before text messaging existed, they walked into a RadioShack. The clerks, who a decade earlier were teaching customers how to solder a motherboard, were now teaching them how to sign a telecommunications contract. This pivot was incredibly lucrative. By the late 1990s, RadioShack was one of the largest sellers of mobile phones in the United States. They formed massive partnerships with carriers like Sprint, transforming thousands of neighborhood stores into mobile activation centers. The foot traffic was staggering. A customer might walk in to buy a replacement fuse, but the clerk was aggressively trained to pivot the conversation toward a new cellular plan. The financial metrics at this peak were astonishing. In 1999, the company was generating over $4 billion in annual revenue. Their stock price soared. They were adding thousands of new customers to their zip code database every single day. The strategy seemed flawless. Use the legacy of the neighborhood parts store to get the customer through the door and then sell them a high-margin monthly telecom contract. But a profound physical shift was happening inside the stores. A cell phone, a portable wireless device that relies on a network of external cell towers rather than internal, user-replaceable parts, was the exact opposite of what RadioShack had historically championed. You could not open a 1990s Nokia or Motorola phone to study its motherboard. You could not fix a broken screen with a soldering iron. You could not buy a Forrest Mims notebook to understand how a cellular network routed its signals. The technology was becoming a black box. It was sealed, proprietary, and strictly controlled by the manufacturer. By becoming the biggest seller of mobile phones, RadioShack was quietly profiting from the death of the tinkering culture that had built their empire. The American consumer was no longer a builder or a mechanic of their own machines. They were becoming purely a user, holding a piece of plastic they were not allowed to open. For a few years, the sheer volume of cash flowing from telecom contracts masked this contradiction. The stores were bustling. The catalog was still thick. The brand was still ubiquitous. But the architecture of the store was beginning to reflect a dangerous new reality. The parts were no longer the priority. The empire had traded its soul for a cellular contract, setting the stage for a collapse that would happen not in the boardroom, but on the physical shelves. The first crack in the RadioShack empire was not a sudden bankruptcy, a catastrophic quarterly earnings report, or a massive store closure. The first crack was physical. It happened directly on the American retail floor. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, store managers across the country received new floor plans from corporate headquarters. For decades, the undisputed center of gravity in any RadioShack had been the parts drawers. The towering, meticulously labeled walls of tiny metal compartments holding resistors, capacitors, fuses, and switches. But under the new directives, these drawers were ordered to be shrunk, consolidated, and pushed into the darkest back corners of the store. The prime real estate at the front of the shop, the brightly lit displays that caught the eye of the mall foot traffic, was given over to Sprint and AT&T cellular kiosks, racks of generic digital cameras, and plastic bins of remote-controlled toys. This was the beginning of a fatal shift in retail physics. RadioShack had made a fateful calculation based entirely on short-term math. A packet of audio fuses or a specific soldering iron sold for a few dollars, yielding a tiny total profit, and requiring the clerk to spend 10 minutes explaining how to use it. But activating a 2-year cell phone contract yielded a massive, immediate commission from the telecom carrier. The math was undeniably in favor of the phones. But this math broke the core identity of the empire. By moving the parts drawers to the back, RadioShack was signaling that it was no longer the store that taught America to tinker. It was abandoning its role as a technology educator to become a telecom middleman. The original customer base, the weekend hobbyists, the electrical engineering students, the fathers trying to fix a broken stereo, felt the shift immediately. When an amateur maker walked into a RadioShack in 2002 looking for a specific coaxial adapter, they were no longer greeted by an eccentric tech wizard who knew the catalog by heart. Instead, they were greeted by a stressed retail clerk who often had no idea what the part was, but who was heavily incentivized by corporate quotas to aggressively pitch a Motorola flip phone and a family data plan. The trust that had been built over decades was evaporating. RadioShack was trading its most loyal, dedicated believers for casual shoppers who just happened to be walking past. At the exact same time, the company was being squeezed from the outside by a new American retail phenomenon, the big box electronics store. Chains like Best Buy and Circuit City were building massive, warehouse-sized locations on highway intersections. If an American family wanted to buy a finished consumer product, a new desktop computer, a flat-screen television, or a home theater system, they no longer went to a cramped 2,000-square-foot RadioShack. They went to the big box retailer, which offered endless aisles of inventory and aggressive discount pricing. RadioShack could not compete on price, and they could no longer compete on selection. Force 2, retail, distribution, and platform access, was turning against them. RadioShack's historic advantage, its neighborhood convenience, was slowly becoming a massive financial trap. Maintaining a physical store within 5 miles of every American was incredibly expensive. Paying rent, utilities, and wages on over 7,000 small retail locations required a constant, massive flow of cash. As the big box stores stole the high-ticket electronics buyers, RadioShack became entirely dependent on those high-margin cell phone contracts just to keep the lights on. They were surviving by selling the exact devices that were training Americans to stop opening up their technology. Then came the internet. In the early 2000s, e-commerce, the habit of buying goods online and having them shipped directly to your door, began to attack the very concept of the weekend save. If a consumer needed a highly specific, obscure audio cable to connect a DVD player to an old television, they no longer had to drive to the local mall and hope the item was in stock at a premium price. They could open a browser, search Amazon or a specialty online retailer, and buy the exact cable for a fraction of the cost. The internet had become the ultimate infinite parts drawer. RadioShack's famous catalog, the thick, multi-hundred-page encyclopedia that had once sat on millions of American coffee tables, was shrinking. It went from a dense technical manual of the future to a thin, uninspiring flyer advertising generic MP3 players and third-party accessories. Eventually, the company stopped printing it altogether. By the mid-2000s, RadioShack was suffering an identity crisis. They were a neighborhood convenience store for electronics, operating in a world where Amazon was becoming the ultimate convenience. They were a parts store that hid its parts. They were a phone store competing against the carrier's own flagship retail shops. But the final fatal blow was not just a change in how people shopped. It was a change in what a device was supposed to do, arriving in a form factor that would clear the shelves completely. In 2007, the definition of consumer electronics collapsed into a single rectangle of glass. The arrival of the modern smartphone, a mobile phone that combines calling, internet access, apps, camera features, and computing power, triggered Force 4: smartphone, cloud, streaming, and convenience displacement. To understand the sheer destructive power of the smartphone on physical retail, you only have to look at a 2005 RadioShack shelf. That year, the store sold Garmin GPS units for the American dashboard. They sold digital point-and-shoot cameras. They sold MP3 players, digital voice recorders, pocket calculators, alarm clocks, and heavy flashlights. They sold the carrying cases, the specialized memory cards, and the endless stream of alkaline batteries required to run all of this independent hardware. Within a few short years, the smartphone absorbed every single one of those physical categories. It turned heavy plastic hardware into weightless, free software applications downloaded directly from an app store. The American consumer no longer needed a GPS unit. They had Google Maps. They no longer needed a digital camera. The lens was built into the back of the phone. They did not need an MP3 player. The music was streaming from the cloud. RadioShack's inventory was evaporating into code. As the hardware categories disappeared, the store was left pushing the only thing that still generated revenue: the smartphones themselves. But even that lifeline was fracturing. By the early 2010s, the major telecommunications carriers realized they no longer needed RadioShack as a middleman. AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile were building their own massive, brightly lit, dedicated retail stores across the country. At the same time, Apple was reinventing retail entirely with the Apple Store, a sleek, minimalist environment, completely devoid of the cluttered pegboards and pushy commission-based sales tactics that defined the RadioShack experience. If an American wanted an iPhone, they went to an Apple store or their carrier. They did not go to a cramped mall store that smelled like old cardboard to negotiate a data plan. Desperate to survive, RadioShack's corporate leadership decided the problem was not their inventory, but their image. In 2009, they launched a massive, multi-million-dollar rebranding campaign. They announced to the American public that they wanted to be called the Shack. It was a fatal miscalculation in brand psychology. By dropping the word radio, the company was officially severing ties with its 1920s engineering roots. They were trying to sound hip and modern to attract a younger demographic that was already buying electronics on Amazon. But in the process, they deeply alienated their last remaining loyalists. When a veteran electrical engineer or an amateur maker heard the name The Shack, they did not hear a modern tech haven. They heard a company that was ashamed of the very tinkering culture that had made it an American institution. The financial reality of maintaining thousands of physical stores began to crush the company. The American shopping mall, the engine of RadioShack's 1980s expansion, was suffering its own massive decline as foot traffic plummeted. RadioShack was locked into thousands of expensive, long-term commercial real estate leases. The stores were heavily staffed, but largely empty. In a final, highly publicized attempt to save the brand, RadioShack purchased a massively expensive commercial during the 2014 Super Bowl. The advertisement featured 1980s pop culture icons physically tearing down a classic RadioShack store, ending with the tagline, "The 80s called, they want their store back." The commercial was a massive viral hit. Millions of Americans laughed, shared the video, and felt a warm surge of nostalgia. But nostalgia does not pay commercial rent. The next morning, nobody went to the store. The American public was happy to remember RadioShack, but they had absolutely no reason to shop there. A year later, the math ran out. In February 2015, RadioShack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The liquidation was swift and clinical. Across the United States, large yellow store-closing banners were draped over thousands of iconic storefronts. The remaining inventory was slashed to clearance prices. Liquidators sold the display cases. They sold the cash registers. They sold the metal pegboards. In thousands of empty American retail spaces, the only things left behind were the towering racks of tiny plastic drawers at the back of the store, emptied of their resistors and switches, auctioned off for pennies to local hobbyists. The inventory evaporated. The shelves emptied. The clerks left. The doors locked. The catalog faded. The brand died. The physical space was gone. The parts drawers were empty. The computers were memories. The phones had consumed the shelf. The doors were locked from the outside. But the disappearance of the store left behind a much larger question about how America would build its future. After the 2015 bankruptcy, the RadioShack name did not immediately vanish. It became a ghost, trapped in Force 5, corporate consolidation, brand survival, and cultural memory. The intellectual property, the famous logo, the customer data, the trademark was purchased by a hedge fund. Over the next several years, the brand underwent a series of bizarre, humiliating resurrections. It was briefly attached to a handful of franchised kiosks inside hobby shops. Later, in an almost surreal pivot, the RadioShack brand was revived as a cryptocurrency exchange platform, its official social media accounts suddenly posting aggressive internet slang to promote digital tokens. It was the ultimate brand dilution. The weakening of a name until it no longer reflects the original promise. The company that had once taught millions of American children how to solder physical circuits had been reduced to an empty digital mascot for crypto speculators. But the true legacy of RadioShack is not found in what happened to the corporate trademark. The true legacy is found in what the American technology landscape lost when the physical stores disappeared. Today, the culture of the American tinkerer still exists. In fact, it is arguably more powerful than ever. The modern maker community, a global network of engineers, hobbyists, and artists, builds incredible projects using microcontrollers like the Arduino or the Raspberry Pi. A Raspberry Pi, a complete credit card-sized computer that costs less than $50, can be programmed to run everything from a home weather station to a retro gaming console. However, this modern ecosystem is entirely digital and heavily centralized around e-commerce. If a modern teenager wants to build a robot, they order the sensors on Amazon, download the code from GitHub, and watch a tutorial on YouTube. It is highly efficient, but it lacks a physical, geographic center. When RadioShack collapsed, America did not just lose a retail chain. It lost the only ubiquitous physical gathering space for hardware enthusiasts. There is no longer a storefront in the suburban mall where a 10-year-old can accidentally discover a 150-in-1 electronic kit while their father buys a battery. There is no longer a local counter where a struggling electrical engineering student can bring a burned-out circuit board and ask a clerk what went wrong. The community moved to the internet, but in doing so, it became invisible to the everyday public. This is not simply nostalgia. Missing the smell of old cardboard and the aggressive sales tactics of a commissioned cell phone clerk is nostalgia. But looking at an old RadioShack parts drawer is a physical argument about the nature of consumer agency. A resistor bought from a local store proves that there was a time when the American public viewed technology as something they could build, modify, and repair themselves. The original RadioShack philosophy was that the machine belonged to the user. If it broke, you opened it. If it was limited, you upgraded it. If you did not understand it, you bought a Forrest Mims notebook and learned how the electrons flowed. Today, Force 4, smartphone, cloud, and convenience displacement, has completely reversed that relationship. The devices we rely on most are sealed blocks of aluminum and glass, held together by industrial adhesive. If you try to open a modern smartphone to replace a battery, you risk voiding the warranty or shattering the screen. The software is licensed, not owned. The data lives on a remote server, not a local hard drive. The loss of the parts store laid the groundwork for modern hardware monopolies. Because there is no longer a local infrastructure for repair, Americans have been conditioned to accept that broken technology must simply be replaced. This exact dynamic birthed the modern right-to-repair movement, a massive legal and cultural battle fought by independent mechanics and farmers demanding the legal right to fix their own smartphones and tractors. The users fighting to unlock the software on their machines today are fighting for the exact same technological agency that RadioShack sold over the counter in 1985. We traded the messy, hands-on friction of the parts drawer for the seamless, frictionless convenience of the App Store. We did not stop wanting technology. We just accepted a version of the future that we are no longer allowed to touch. In the end, RadioShack was the victim of a perfectly executed technological transition. They built the retail infrastructure that taught America how to use electronics. And America learned the lesson so well that it eventually engineered the store out of existence. But the physical evidence of that era still survives, quietly scattered across the country. Go to an estate sale in Ohio, or check the back wall of an independent auto garage in Texas, and you will likely find them. Somewhere in an American garage, a metal RadioShack parts cabinet still sits on a dusty workbench. The tiny plastic drawers are still meticulously labeled with masking tape, capacitors, fuses, switches, and LEDs. Inside, a few loose components remain, waiting for a soldering iron that is no longer plugged in, waiting to repair a machine that the world has already thrown away. See you in the next one.